Thank you for joining us for our program today. My name is Gavin Cleespies, and I'm the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. Our program this afternoon will look at a new book, Laid Waste: The Culture of Exploitation in Early America. This publication examines the modernizing process in America and Europe that locked together science and technology, political democracy, economic freedom, and competitive capitalism, and in so doing produced unimaginable wealth and material comfort to some, yet also brought the global environment to a tipping point. So obviously a very timely publication, and the discussion today will be led by the author of the book, Professor John Larson. John Larson is a professor at Purdue University. He studied history at Luther College and Brown University. Before coming to Purdue, he served as the director of research at Corner Prairie Pioneer Settlement and taught at Earlham College. His earlier publications include Bonds of Enterprise, John Murray Forbes and the Western Development in America's Railway Age, Internal Improvement, National Public Works and the Promise of Popular Government in the Early United States, and the Market Revolution in America. So, John, welcome to the Mass Historical Society.
Okay, well, off we go. Thank you, Gavin and Sarah, for setting this up. And to all my other friends at Mass Historical, I've been there 2 or 3 different times. And my hope, of course, was to do this in person. This is the next best thing in these strange days of social distancing and quarantine and all the rest. At any rate, I'm delighted to be here and have this opportunity to share some thoughts with you about this book, which came out last November and has, to some extent, been swallowed up by the COVID-19, like almost everything else that's going on these days. Let me start right in. It's no longer news that we Americans have degraded our environment in the name of freedom and progress. We're not alone, of course. The Western world has done a pretty good job of this as well as the Americans. The signs of an exhausted earth and the resulting social and cultural destruction are pretty much all around us. For some people, this has come as a surprise. An unexpected disappointment, if you will, at the end of a terrific run of progress that goes back 250 years or so now. Yet hidden in the familiar tale of how this land was conquered and transformed by our ancestors, there lies another narrative. And a closer study reveals that how the ideas, perceptions, and choices made by generations past contributed to what I'm calling a culture of exploitation that shaped and guided modernization in the New World. This alternative narrative leads relentlessly to the present environmental crisis. So it's not a surprise, but in some sense, of the logical outcome of this other narrative. But it also, it's possible that the same alternate narrative, this new history, can suggest ways to approach the critical century ahead. So rather than just writing a doom and gloom book, I'm trying to offer here a way of reframing the past that might give us some insight into a way forward. Laid Waste tracks the construction of this culture of exploitation, reaching back to the early modern England. And the book exposes the dark side of discovery and development by settlers in the New World. Celebrating freedom from limits and constraints that were left behind in England, British settlers in North America tamed, in their language, what, quote, they called a howling wilderness, and laid the foundations for American power. All the while, these European Americans crafted a triumphal narrative in which they played the leading role, promoting individual liberty, enterprise, and industry, technology, innovation, and capitalist development. Over time, the worship of individual freedom and limitless progress became so embedded in our stories that now we tend to see them as right and natural and essential to our freedom and progress. Well, this simply is not true. Modernization indeed generated American wealth and power, but it did so at a price that was paid by environmental ecosystems and by the rest of the global population. Our settler forebears attacked the native populations in North America, expropriated their abundant resources, bound hundreds of thousands of Africans in slavery, not just to satisfy their basic needs, but to magnify their acquisitive desires. Exploitation through wind-powered sailing ships, state-sponsored commerce, staple crop plantation agriculture, and a tragically brutal form of racial slave labor set the stage for industrialization. Then, powered by the use of fossil fuels to drive big machines, industrialization radically transformed material life in American and Western European societies, resulting in the modern capitalist world order. The story told by the victors naturalized these patterns of exploitation and established what economists like to call free market forces as if they were laws of nature, akin to gravity or thermodynamics. The process of modernization, however, now has brought the global environment to a tipping point, beyond which life as we know it may not be sustainable. Since 1971, our children and grandchildren have learned as much from the story of the Lorax by Dr. Seuss. Still, many intelligent adults refuse to reflect historically on the ideas and practices that have made us rich and powerful. In truth, the natural, quote, natural forces supposedly driving modernization rely on axioms every bit as arbitrary as the bases of decimal arithmetic or Euclidean geometry or modern particle physics. In fact, history abounds with examples of axiomatic assumptions that we have managed to revise or abandon in the pursuit of more satisfying ways to understand the world. For example, early generations of smart people believed that political legitimacy and national independence depended on divine right monarchy. If you did not have a monarch that had been appointed by God, you could not have a stable state. We have learned to believe otherwise. In the 1500s, Western European people discovered that their wealth and power could be magnified greatly by enslaving African laborers. For nearly 300 years, this conviction reigned supreme, and then, within about 50 years, it fell from favor in much of Europe and America. Well, to accommodate the new realities of climate change and the global crisis in the 21st century, I think we in the West must imagine a paradigm shift of similar magnitude. We must notice, first of all, that there is a paradigm, that modernization is not nature itself, but is a story that we tell about how nature works. We must then find its roots in history and then challenge its truth claims. We must learn to celebrate intelligent resource management and planet-wide sense of the common good. Sustainability and optimization must replace individual profit as the fundamental measure of economic value. Holistic concerns for human populations and their neighborhood ecosystems, something that once was common among primitive cultures, must supersede narrow atomistic claims about private rights and gains, as if the advantage of any individual outweighs the common good of the planet. Long ago, terms like liberty, equality, ambition, even natural law seemed dangerous and disruptive until in the 18th century they found their way into common thought and discourse. Popes, princes, and philosophers long ago denounced free markets as dangerously antisocial until they were redefined rather abruptly in the 19th century as ideal and incorruptible. My goal in this book is to show that another paradigm shift is achievable and survivable. Now, let me offer a quick tour of the argument, and it will be a very quick a synopsis. There's almost 300 pages of it waiting for you if you want to read the whole thing. But I start with a chapter called Stability. Our colonial forefathers came from a culture that cherished stability and order. Inequality defined that social, economic, and political system, but it was inequality tempered by reciprocal obligations. The wealth and power of the few obligated them to guarantee subsistence for the many who served and obeyed them. The appearance of scarcity justified these inequalities. Individual agency in the world of stability was restricted to a tiny class of elites. And even among those, ambition was stifled and greed suppressed by social and religious expectations. I treat that as a kind of a starting point, the world before the world changed. My second chapter is called Abundance, in which the people of the world of stability encounter an unexpected world of boundless resources. So it was this culture of stability that launched the colonial projects that became European settlements in the New World. And the introduction of unimagined abundance profoundly upset the framework of stability. In newly developed settlements, men of reckless ambition found reward and few restraints. And institutions designed to impose inequality and enforce reciprocity faltered. Individualism flourished, and the prospect of improving one's station in life replaced the traditional objective of simply staying safe in place. The colonies, in short, became a new arena for unbridled self-love. That's a language that they used a great deal in the 17th century. Chapter 3 turns to the matter of achievement. Colonization proved difficult and dangerous. Anybody who's been through junior high, at least, knows about the starving times. But over time, through the application of labor, their own and that of slaves, and the exploitation of Atlantic markets, American settlers found themselves safe, secure, and increasingly wealthy. After 1700, the colonies surveyed with pride their own achievement and took full credit for it, ignoring both the windfall represented by the environment itself and the contributions of cosmopolitan Britain in creating and maintaining profitable markets. Chapter 4 takes up the issue of liberation. After 1765, our colonial ancestors staged a rebellion against the mother country, recasting their pride in the achievement of the new, recasting their pride in this achievement in new revolutionary clothing, as if their good fortune was but a prelude to the great work of preserving liberty, as they said, from old world corruption. This abrupt reshaping of colonial history required some fancy rhetorical exercises by our revolutionary leaders, but they managed to recruit enough support among the people by promising liberty, equality, and self-government. To all who would help them win. With independence firmly in hand, liberated Americans then turned to assess their own future. Coastal settlements showed serious wear and tear by the end of the 18th century, giving rise to some calls for agricultural reform, resource husbandry, and economic restraint. But if one lifted one's gaze to the west, unimaginable abundance stretched quite literally across the continent. With such bounty free for the taking, why would a free people impose limits and restraints on themselves? It seemed to make no sense. Real progress, they believed, lay in front of them in the form of more and better exploitation of land, labor, and resources. The key to this next chapter, improvement, was the idea of improvement, the application of industry and ingenuity to a resource base to magnify its productivity. So inventory showed them the boundless resource base, and improvement will give them the key to taking advantage of it. Technology took on a leading role in the 19th century story, giving ambitious entrepreneurs new tools and techniques with which to develop their, what they called, wilderness. Liberty itself empowered most white men to participate in an economic free-for-all in the 19th century that set the stage for industrialization as well as the agrarian conquest of the American interior. Excuse me. Chapter 7 takes up the question of destiny, which again, every high school textbook has a chapter on manifest destiny. Excuse me. The astonishing progress of material success in antebellum America seemed to people at the time to be proof enough that the United States had been blessed with a world historical mission. Driven not by greed or gain, but by destiny, Americans marched across the continent, displacing everyone in their way and spreading what they called civilization across God's forgotten wasteland. After an embarrassing pause that we call the Civil War, to purge the shame of slavery and establish an unchallenged system of free labor and free enterprise, post-Civil War Americans returned to the business of mastering their systems as they had launched them before the war. As they encountered frustrations in the form of arid Western lands, diminishing timberland, extravagant spaces to be covered, or urban industrial pollution as we get into the end of the 19th century, their ingenuity and technological prowess seemed capable of solving all of these problems, sealing off the culture of exploitation from any useful feedback loop of information. One might ask, by this point, you're 250 pages into the book, one might ask, and many did, were there no dissenters? Were there no contrary voices, no challengers, no voices objecting to the juggernaut of industrial progress? And indeed there were. And Chapter 9 reviews some of them, starting with Thoreau and Emerson, and ending, ending with a look at John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt. The birth of the 20th century saw the rise of our first conservation movement, aimed primarily at preserving natural wonders like the national park system and perpetuating a natural resource base for modernization into the future. Because the existing literature on environmental history so richly chronicles the 20th century story, I chose to stop at this point, roughly 1900 or 1910 or so, and turn then to an epilogue designed to sum up the point and return to the central message of the book. And that central message lies in the problem of the common good. Thus we return to modernization and the common good. It is my belief that self-centered, self-righteous, self-created, self-governed, self-obsessed individuals simply cannot foster community. The natural result of atomistic individualism is a Hobbesian dystopia marked by suspicion, competition, and anger. But this libertarian excess is not our only legacy. The utopian side of the American experience originally contained a commonwealth ideal and support for terms like sufficient, adequate, and satisfactory. To this day, 4 states still call themselves commonwealths, of course, including Massachusetts. Even if honored in the breach, the restrictions on the sin of avarice were commonplace in the cultures of our ancestors. And they survive in ethical creeds, from secular humanism to Baha'i to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. In the culture of exploitation, backed up by classical economic claims about the virtue of greed as the one true human motivation, these words are dismissed as childish sentiments without a place in the real world. But we can embrace that Commonwealth tradition while standing inside our history and our heritage. That's the central claim I want to make toward the end here. We don't have to be different. We don't have to leave the American experiment in order to do differently in the 21st century. With far less provocation, our revolutionary forebears took such a leap in 1776 to launch the world's first new self-created nation. I think we have an even better impulse to want to do so again. Oops, sorry, too many. There we go. The Lorax of Dr. Seuss. In that story, the greedy Onceler cut down the truffula trees to knit thneeds, a thing so useless and attractive that the market for it grew exponentially. Speaking for the trees and the living things that loved them, the Lorax begged him to stop, but only when the last tree was felled did the factory shut down, leaving a barren landscape with bad air, foul water, and no living things. In sorrow and disgust, the Lorax ascended into heaven, quote, heisted himself without a trace. Well, this is clearly a redemption story, the point of which our children recognize without effort. So do the high priests of orthodox economic liberalism. One such spokesman for liberalism put together a recent attack on a website called bluecarp.net, explaining exactly what Dr. Seuss got wrong. In that argument, he says no capitalist would exhaust his raw materials. It simply couldn't be done. It's counterintuitive. And of course, can't imagine that this could ever possibly happen, even though it happened almost endlessly throughout 300 years. The second argument he made, private ownership would have prevented the spoliation of the forests. According to D.K. Williams, the only reason that the Onceler could cut down all the trees was because it wasn't private property. If he had owned the forest, he would have taken better care to husband it. Williams also argues that thneeds could not be useless by definition because, after all, people bought them. And the definition of a useful product is if people buy it. One wonders what he would make of mood rings and pet rocks. And finally, personal liberty is the central purpose of life, according to this economic dogma, so that the concerns of the Lorax were simply contradictory to the point of life, which is individual freedom. Alas, reciting this catechism will not alter the judgment of the scientists. The reckoning is here. Business as usual is not an option, or at least not a viable option into the future. Simple denial seems comforting and remains popular, especially if we watch only monthly or quarterly earnings reports. One of the greatest problems with the culture of exploitation is its tendency to look in the very, very short term and not in the long term. The problem is that denial guarantees ultimate tragedy of the commons. In the state of denial, we must grab the last tree before those who have cheated, those we have cheated, cheat us back. What's required, I'm arguing in this book, is a new mental framework, without which our efforts will not cohere. We need a new metrics that capture the commons, not just the tragedy of the commons. We need new models of personal and national interest. We need to recover the more utopian side of the revolutionary republicanism that founded this country. With luck, cooperation, and real ingenuity, we can address the climate and environmental crises of the coming century. We can reimagine the gift of liberty and the meaning of American freedom. I believe we can try once more, in the words of Tom Paine, to make the world anew. Go and read again The Lorax of Dr. Seuss. Thank you.
Margaret, did you have a question?
Yes, I would like Dr. Larson to talk about the concept of growth, which seems to be the fundamental premise of our economic system today and seems just conceptually to be unsustainable in the long term.
Well, this is something that economists are increasingly raising questions about themselves. The capitalist system thrives on growth, and that's been the source of what we consider progress, the generation of wealth, and all of that. Growth does not always have to be quantitative enlargement. Growth can also be the result of efficiencies, the result of more intelligent behavior, the result of better, more equitable distributions. There's nothing in the world that says economic activity must pile up wealth in the hands of a few at the expense of the many. An encouraging number of modern economists are beginning to question this. Thomas Piketty just came out with another 1,000-page book called Capital and Ideology, in which he makes a very compelling argument for the idea that inequality is the primary purpose of our assumptions about economy, and that they're not essential to either growth or prosperity, but they are essential to maintaining the freedom of exploitation in the hands of the people who own most of the property. Whether or not you like that line of argument, I think any kind of sustainability involves growth for the sake of distribution, growth for the sake of catching up, growth for the sake of justice and something more like a reasonable standard of living, and then a great deal of what we call growth can, and I think must, be redirected toward the kinds of efficiencies and economies that will stop the destruction of the planet and very possibly either stop or even, if we're lucky, reduce the trajectories of global warming and collapse that we're facing. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to recognize that about a quarter to a third of the world's people consume the vast majority of the world's resources. And if we were to share a similar lifestyle with the other 2/3 of the world's people, we would need 2, possibly 3 more planets of raw material in order to do this. Well, we don't have 2 or 3 more planets, and I'm not sure we can squeeze quite that much gain out of just a little efficiency in a transistor or a better battery in my hybrid car. But there's obviously a limit to growth, and the key is to take actions in such a way that rather than crashing into the Grand Canyon of ended growth, we find some way to come up with what I'd call a softer landing.
Great. So Barbara has typed in, did you notice any regional differences about community use of resources and thoughts about wealth while researching the book, especially in the 17th century between Massachusetts and other northern colonies and Virginia and other southern colonies?
Certainly. In fact, the second chapter on abundance, it works its way through Virginia, Massachusetts, and then down into the Caribbean for a couple of examples of sugar islands. And in each case, there was a good deal of difference about the details, the general trajectory. In Massachusetts, for example, there was a much stronger effort on the part of the Puritan establishment to reimpose that culture of stability, that sense of restraint and community. And yet they found themselves almost incapable of doing so because at the same time, they were utterly excited about the prospect of taking Indian land and making themselves rich. And it's pretty hard to In fact, John Winthrop got himself tied in knots over it. It was very hard to celebrate the prospect of we can all become rich and at the same time justify why I should be richer than you. And you should surrender that opportunity if it's not in my interest. And in Virginia, of course, it was bare naked almost from the beginning. Although John Smith, to his credit, wrote eloquently about how he wished it weren't. And he wrote vicious critiques of the kind of people that surrounded him in Virginia. The problem, of course, is that the kind of people that surrounded him in Virginia were people like himself, and the conditions in Virginia simply rewarded whatever ambitions they had. It's very interesting when you move to the Sugar Islands. One that I looked at was Providence Island, which is Puritans again, but they made almost no effort to prevent the kind of rise of a commercial society, and instead went straight to a slave-dominated sugar culture. And then, of course, Barbados, which became the poster child for sugar and slaves, and for that model of exploitation. The key to that kind of an approach was simply that Englishmen had no intention of staying there. They found it a horrible place to live. But as long as they could import enough Africans to do the work and could commandeer enough white servants to keep the Africans in line, the money poured in. And so there's a variety of stories, and you could probably pick up 6 or 8 more colonial stories, especially in the 17th century, with different variations in each case. What knits them all together is the fact that almost nothing from the old English culture of stability was able to survive in the face of the incredible opportunities that New World abundance presented. What they did not have, in England, what they had taken advantage of was the ancient assumption that the few would own the resources and the many would shut up and do what they were told. When they got to America, the resources were by definition not owned by anyone. And it made it very difficult to impose the idea that they belong to the crown, or they belong to the leaders, or they belong to one group over another. And once people discovered that there were ways to get their hands on property, it was very difficult to stop them.
Okay. Well, Megan has her hand up, so we can allow her to talk. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. Hi, John. It's Megan Black, and I really appreciated your presentation, much like I appreciate your book and the way that it's able to bring this very multifaceted culture of exploitation into one frame. And I love how you try to help us think through a pathway moving forward that draws on the insights about how this model of growth and abundance was predicated on these structures of racism and inequality that, justified acquisitive behaviors across different expanding frontiers. So I'm thinking about what are some practical steps that we might think through about the problem of the inequitable distribution. So if we listen to the environmental justice movement today, are there any ideas that have cropped up, or maybe referring back to history, are there paths not taken that allow us to think through things? So here I'm spitballing, but like sometimes reparations for slavery and colonialism come up as being vital to the climate change discussion. So do you have any thoughts about those kinds of mechanisms based on your research?
Well, I have all kinds of thoughts. They are not necessarily based on my research. And that's why I very carefully point out that the central claim I'm trying to make is not that I know what to do next, but that I recognize that there is a paradigm that we need to uncouple. I'm banking heavily on the idea that once we make that first step, then and admit, for example, that classical economics does not describe the same kind of phenomenon that the law of gravity does. As soon as we accept the possibility that a distributive system, which is not inherently individualistic or inherently competitive, does not produce the end of the world. It does not produce a Soviet-style stagnation. Karl Polanyi, who wrote clear back in the 1940s eloquently about the fact that that economics did not used to be disembedded in this way until the 19th century. And that's exactly the same thing that Thomas Piketty is arguing now, that it is a way of organizing economic activity, but is not the way or the only way. And in some ways, it's not the best way. One of the central things that I'm trying to attack in this book is the claim that we hear over and over again on the question of climate change and fossil fuels and all of that. The idea that we just can't afford to change. We can afford almost anything. I mean, we are the richest, most incredibly productive, most exploitative people the planet has ever seen. We can afford whatever we set our minds to. We choose not to. And one of the reasons that I put the book together this way is to try and say, we can choose to change that assumption. We can choose to say we can afford this. And in a recent op-ed piece that I have not yet placed anywhere, I make the point that in the face of the coronavirus, all of a sudden, Republicans and Democrats in Congress can pass trillions of dollars of fiat money in order to prop up a system that we consider to be essential and natural. And yet those very same people have argued for years and years and years that we cannot give money away to poor people, to hungry people, to unemployed. We cannot afford to right any of the injustices of the past because it would simply destroy the economy. Well, which is it? You know, if $3 trillion in order to keep the stock market afloat does not destroy the economy, why would $3 trillion to feed people be so much worse? It just makes no sense to me.
I think that's a very good point, and I think it's also interesting to think about the money spent following 9/11 and the military response,
Right?
Compared to what's being proposed in terms of public health. And then if you look at the death tolls, it's about 3,000 on 9/11. It's about 100,000 right now. So
yeah, it's a little shocking, really.
Yeah. So Maura typed in a question that said, is there a decade or period that you would identify as the turning point in the move away from the common good?
Oh, I'll give you three. They run together, but I would say basically the first 3 decades of the 19th century is when I think we truly lost our way. And this is another point where people don't necessarily like my argument, but I'm making kind of the pogo argument here to say that we lost our way. That is, the American people embraced individualism, that kind of unrestrained competitive behavior as a piece of liberty, as a piece of freedom. And given that they had grown up in a world of mercantilism and inequality and what seemed to them to be arbitrary props to the wealth and power of the few, one can certainly understand why this seemed very exciting. But if you look at the period 1800 to the early 1830s or so, there's this wild embrace of markets as an alternative to the corrupt manipulation of variables by corrupt governments or kings or queens or elites of one form or another. And this seemed to be the magic cure. Markets will distribute successfully what corrupt administrators will not distribute successfully. And actually, up until the middle 30s, it appeared to be doing so. This is part of the reason I think that we embraced it so successfully. And then you start to get the panics. 1819 was certainly a wake-up call, but it was the first massive kind of breakdown of the market system, and people had reason to believe it was an anomaly. 1837 and then 39 got to appear more like it was going to be systemic. 57, again. 73, again. 81, again. 93, and on and on and on we go. So eventually you have the recognition among the classical economists that there's this thing called a business cycle, and that you just have to live with it. That and in a sense, it's like an infection. You know, it's something that gets loose once in a while, and you have to live through it. That's part of the naturalizing I've been talking about. It isn't essential. I mean, it is essential to a free market economy. But hardly anybody in the world actually has a free market economy. The British and the Americans come as close as anyone ever has. And yet we have more social welfare for corporations and industries, far more than we have for people or services or anything like that. And as Gavin was suggesting, if you look at our expenses in war, the possible exception of the Second World War, most of what we spend on war is on behalf of the culture of exploitation. And Megan Black, who was just on a minute ago, has written a fabulous book about how something as benign as the Interior Department has been an agent of extraordinary exploitation around the world in the guise of simply developing natural resources, which is to say seizing them for the advantage of Americans over people who weren't using them.
Well, Nina has raised her hand, so we can allow her to ask a question.
Yeah.
Yourself.
Hello.
Thank you. Hi, how are you?
Good. Thanks.
I really appreciate that you started the book with the period of time, which I'm assuming is 16th, 17th century, ideas around that sort of reciprocal idea that, you know, those with power and wealth have some responsibility to those with less.
Right.
And I see that a lot in the histories of New England in particular, and the Puritan ideas and blah, blah, blah. And I'm wondering how I struggle with reconciling that idea with the actions of, Great Britain in the 16th century, the exploitation of Ireland and Scotland, and then in the United States, the exploitation of Native Americans, and then Africans. So how I don't know if you can answer that, but is there a way to reconcile the ideas of reciprocity and responsibility with the actual actions of people?
Well, certainly you're absolutely right, and honored in the breach is probably the quickest and easiest way to get around it. First of all, the culture of stability to some extent is it's a prop against which to park the first of a series of claims that will then march through the rest of the book. And in various places, even in that chapter, I point out that this was a very fragile idea that was suffering all kinds of difficulties in the 16th and 17th century, and was literally toppling as the new world came online. So it's not as stark a contrast. It's a useful sort of arguing tool. But the fact of the matter is, you go back to R.H. Tawney, go back to the agrarian crisis in the 16th century, and the crisis of the aristocracy, from all that literature from the 60s and 70s in England. You see that's all falling apart in England. And of course, what's knocking it down is the same thing. It's the access to markets and the possibility for profits by people who were in theory not supposed to have access to those things. I think one of the things I make more of than most people who've written about this is the idea that when you move toward a modern free economic system, you admit more and more people to agency. And when 5% of the population are the only ones allowed to make decisions that cost people their living, that cost people their survival, it's not that hard to keep that 5% in line. When you give 80% of the people free rein to do whatever they want with whatever little bit of resources they have, it becomes untenable. Thankfully, Adam Smith promised us that the competitive marketplace would take care of that. Unfortunately, the competitive market, and Smith himself actually understood this quite well. He assumed the competitive marketplace would take care of that in a culture of Christian gentlemen. The theory of moral sentiments is the predecessor to the Wealth of Nations, and without his assumption about the kinds of culture of moral sentiments that made England civilized, he would have placed, I think, nowhere near so much faith in the idea of the marketplace. And if you read Wealth of Nations carefully, there are all kinds of places where he admits that he thinks that capitalists are probably cheats and liars, and that there is certainly a proclivity among people to cheat their neighbors. But he's sort of hoping into the wind. He's hoping that everyone will be, at least well enough armed with information and capital that they can keep each other in check. The two things that he utterly failed to comprehend, and Joseph Stiglitz writes about this in several different places, is the inequality of information, access to information, and the inequality of access to capital. Adam Smith liked to talk about the local miller, and if he decides to raise the price of bread too high, even if he gets away with it and the assize people don't come down on him, someone else will open a bakery and start selling bread cheaper. Well, that's fine. When Pillsbury builds $1 million milling operation in Minneapolis, and then they start selling Wonder Bread, around the continental United States, who's going to jump in and check that kind of market power? And the whole centerpiece of Al Chandler's theory about managerial capitalism is that at a certain level, economies of scale reward high capital, very expensive, and frankly quite sluggish kinds of organizations, which will then dig in and protect themselves, which is exactly what Adam Smith said capitalists would do if you let them get together over cocktails and didn't send somebody in to listen to what they were saying.
Thanks. So Andrew wrote a question that says, how does your concept of the culture of exploitation interact with the current literature? For example, I'm thinking Alfred W. Crosby's ecological imperialism and the results climate crisis of imprinting European agriculture and and animal systems around the world. Sorry, I had a notification that went up over the.
Oh, okay.
Couldn't see it.
Yeah, well, I've relied in the past in many different ways on Crosby's work, and particularly the ecological imperialism, the whole idea of Europe exporting its ecosystem with it. Its agricultural plants and animals, its understanding of resources and what they're good for and all that sort of thing. So I think that my argument and his arguments intersect, I think, fairly compatibly. My focus was trying to keep an eye more on agency and intentional behavior, whereas I think Crosby's looking more at the larger unanticipated consequences. I remember there's a wonderful piece in there about, I think it was one of the Azores, where somebody let some rabbits loose. And 50 years later, there was nothing left green on the island because rabbits just do what rabbits do. And of course, one of the beauties of environmental history is that it's full of these kinds of forces that are not under anyone's control. Unfortunately, that fact often opens the door then to people saying, well, we can't do anything about it. Climate change is going to happen. Climate change has always happened. Climates always get hot, they get cold, things change. That's the way it goes. Some people are arguing that it'll be great because we'll be able to play golf year round in Minnesota. So, not to worry. Well, that's all true. And the other truth is that climate change will not destroy the planet. Climate change will destroy the habitat that human beings require for the planet. Climate change didn't destroy the planet, it destroyed the dinosaurs. And we don't have any now. And we too could be dinosaurs, but the planet will be around, as will other planets. Heat death, I think, is several hundred billion years in the future, farther ahead than I'm really worried about. Environmental history, in some ways, the environment is to use a musical metaphor, it's the continual line. It's the double bass, doing long whole notes back and forth behind all of this sort of thing. Fernand Braudel did very much the same thing wonderfully in the opening of the Mediterranean, where he talked about those long, slow forces that peasants and shepherds and people like that understood to be the forces of history. And then, 1,500 pages later, you get to the court of Philip II, where people make decisions in the matter of an afternoon. And those different time frames are absolutely essential. My goal was to try and get to focus a lens on the kind of decision making that people actually do, and therefore exposed those moments. I think that was Megan that was asking about those moments in which people had a choice. They chose left and not right. They chose right and not left. And they're not big choices. It's not like there's a moment in which we said, oh, to hell with it, let's go here. But it's the accumulation of hundreds and hundreds of what seem to be innocuous choices until you finally turn around and realize that these lock themselves together in a system. Industrialization is a perfect example. Not one of the innovations that produced big machine industrialization was immediately recognized as a world-changing affair. Each one was a solution to a very simple problem. If you've ever done hand spinning, and we use textiles to death. If you ever did hand spinning, you'd realize that for 100 years, the idea that you could somehow ramp up a spinning wheel so that you could make 16 threads instead of one was just enormously attractive, because making one thread was very slow, and you could spin all day long and not have enough to make a stocking. All of a sudden, somebody comes up with a simple solution, it's called a spinning jenny, and you can make 16, and then you can make 32, and then pretty soon it's 64, and then it's 15,000 spindles running with the water power behind it. But no one saw that coming quite that way. They invent a steam engine to pump water out of a coal mine, because coal was absolutely essential for the Midlands in England, not in order to make more iron and steel, but because they'd run out of timber. They cut all their trees down. The truffulas were gone. And so they needed the coal, and they needed to pump the water out. Once they figured out how to do that, and then Watt says, well, I got an idea, put a crank on that sucker and we can make it go around. And away you go. This kind of locking together of small incremental steps is what made the culture so attractive, so seductive, but also irreversible. And all you have to do is, look at, here we sit talking on Zoom around the world because we can't go out. Well, I'm sure that in the 14th century, people would have enjoyed doing that too. They didn't have the choice.
Okay, so I think we have time for one more question, and Anna has raised her hand, so we'll let Anna speak if she would like to. Anna, do you have a question?
Hi, Dad. Can you hear me all right?
I can, yes.
Wonderful. Well, I have a question on behalf of your grandson, who I am raising in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. He has read the Lorax, but he is also finishing up these weeks of remote learning. He's finishing up a unit on the American Revolution, and I have been struck as I have been helping him with his homeschooling, how our narrative about those kinds of American milestones have not changed since I was 11 and studying the American Revolution, and recall some of the things you told me when I was 11 about the American Revolution that we weren't necessarily talking about in school. And we continue to tell our children that the American Revolution was a story of revolting against tyranny and of the fight for freedom and liberty, and that England was bad and American colonists were being treated unfairly, and that this was an incredible victory. And certainly lots of kinds of those things are true. But when we paint it simply as the American colonists were the Jedi and England was the Death Star, how will my son and children of his generation, how will they recognize the kind of paradigm that you're talking about in order to see that there's a much more nuanced story unfolding here? How will we start to teach them to go looking for it?
Well, I started with you by trying to tell you a long time ago that the story of the revolution was a revolting story. The real question is, when do you introduce that kind of critical perspective? I often tell my college students that I don't really want fourth graders to take up arms against the regime, because their judgments are not necessarily dependable. The Lord's Republican Army in Africa is a good example of what happens when you arm 8-year-olds and tell them they're fighting for liberty. But certainly much sooner than we generally do, we need to introduce the possibility that there's more to these stories. The American Revolution will always be a tough one because, of course, it's the bedrock of our patriotic narrative. And it's a very mixed story. I mean, on the one hand, the idea of freedom and democracy are enormously attractive and should be enormously attractive. On the other hand, they were not pursued in the way that the narrative would like us to believe. They have been perverted and distorted over time. Perhaps one of the better alternate narratives that we can take up right now is the narrative that in the beginning, Americans had slaves. And then they discovered that slavery was evil, and they had a civil war, and they got rid of slavery. And isn't that nice? And yet in every city in the country right now, we're still watching people say, yes, but, yes, but, yes, but. And we've been saying yes, but since I was 11. And we will probably be saying yes, but when your grandson is 11. Because these things are, the narratives are durable, they're comforting, particularly comforting for those of us whose interests they serve. Part of what I'm trying to do, and part of what I've been trying to do all these years as a history teacher, is to shake people out of that comfort and get them to recognize that, especially in a free society, you have an obligation to know that there is another side to that story.
That was a remarkably timely way to end the program, and I think it was a great presentation, so thank you for joining us, and thanks to all of our guests for joining us. Before we go, we want to make sure that people know that they can buy a copy of Laid Waste. We'd encourage everyone to support their own local bookstore. If you don't have a favorite local bookstore, MHS's favorite shop is Trident Books, and they have it in stock and it's in your house. So if you order it, it will be at your door shortly, and you'll be supporting a locally owned business. As always, we say, we hope you enjoyed this program. We're happy to present these programs for free during this period of coronavirus. But if people do have the ability to support nonprofits, the MHS is a nonprofit, and we would encourage you to consider supporting our organization. So thank you for making time for us, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the afternoon. And thank you, John, for joining us.
Thank you, Gavin.